Today we get familiar with the motion picture film process, the mechanical choreography behind cinematic storytelling. From gauges and frame rates to shutter angles and exposure, we will unpack how each decision shapes not just the image, but the emotion. Before we dive into the mechanics, here's our roadmap for this video. First, we'll define what a motion picture really is, not just technically, but perceptually. Then we'll explore how frame rate, shutter angle, and shutter speed work together to shape exposure time and motion blur. We'll compare Cine cameras and DSLR mirrorless systems and show how each tool affects image texture. Finally, we'll look at how filmmakers use exposure deliberately, not just to light a scene, but to sculpt tone, rhythm, and emotion. Each concept builds toward a deeper understanding of cinematic motion, exposure logic, and visual storytelling. Let's begin with the physical foundation of motion picture film, the format and the gauge. A film format refers to the technical blueprint, how a movie is recorded and projected. This includes the width of the film stock and implicitly the number of perforations and the frame size. The film gauge is the width of the film strip itself. It's a physical measurement, not a digital setting. Here you'll see a representation of a 35mm film, where each exposed and processed frame spans 4 perforations. This is the classic 4-perf pull-down used in traditional theatrical releases. The negative exposure process begins when light hits the emulsion, forming a latent image. That image is chemically developed into a visible negative, the first physical trace of the story. If you've studied photography, this should feel familiar. Next, we shift to 16mm film, where each frame spans 1 perforation. This format is more compact and economical, often used in documentaries, education, and indie productions before the digital revolution. But these aren't the only gauges. Let's briefly walk through the others. There is the 8mm, introduced in the 1930s for amateur use. 1 perf per frame. Soft, grainy images are created, perfect for home movies. Then there's the Super 8, a 1960s upgrade to 8mm with better image area and cartridge loading. There is also the 65/70mm, used for high-resolution epics. The 65mm film stock is used for capture, while the 70mm is used for projection. There is an extra 5mm for the magnetic soundtrack. And then there's the IMAX 70mm, a horizontal format with 15 perforations per frame, delivering unmatched resolution and immersion. The number and shape of perforations affect how the film moves through the camera and how each frame is exposed. Their spacing determines frame pitch, and their geometry affects transport stability. But the choice of format affects more than just mechanics. It shapes the aesthetic, the texture, and the emotional impact of the image. It's not merely a technical decision, it's a creative one. This is a 35mm Ari camera, a classic example of a film-based motion picture camera. You'll notice the film magazine, the lens mount, and the viewfinder. But what matters most for now is that this camera uses 35mm film, the standard gauge for theatrical releases. Each frame advances through the camera using a precise mechanical system, which we will explore later. This image anchors us in the physical reality of analog filmmaking, before we break it down into its moving parts. Here we have a 16mm Ari camera. Compared to the 35mm system, this camera uses 16mm film, where each frame typically spans just one perforation. That tighter frame-to-perf ratio allows for more economical shooting and smaller camera bodies. The compact, versatile 16mm format was introduced in the 1920s as a non-theatrical alternative, and it became a staple in classrooms, newsrooms, and guerrilla film sets. Its interior mechanism is exactly like that of the 35mm camera. Now let's look at the 16mm camera's mechanism. This view is from the side of the film gate, the same side where the film magazine attaches to the camera body. Although it uses a smaller gauge, this is still a full-fledged motion picture camera, engineered for precision, built for storytelling. The film gate here is represented by a red square when the shutter is closed, blocking light. Now imagine loading a 16mm film negative through the camera, pressed flat against this gate. It gives you a sense of the camera's scale and industrial design. The emulsion side of the film, the light-sensitive layer, is the matte side, facing the gate and receiving the exposure. The shiny side is the base layer facing outward towards us right now, and it often carries edge markings. The claw mechanism engages with the film's perforations and advances it one frame at a time. As the gate is wiped to yellow, the shutter opens, allowing light to pass through the lens and expose the emulsion. Then it's wiped back to red as it closes again and the next frame moves into place. This is the mechanical choreography of analog filmmaking. Claw movement, shutter movement, exposure, repeat. Let's visualize that with negative exposures forming on the film strip. As the claw mechanism pulls the film down one perforation at a time, each frame is held steady in the gate and exposed to light. The result is a series of latent images invisible at first but chemically developable into visible negatives. In a real camera, these exposed frames would be successive images of the same scene in motion, each one slightly offset in time and position as the film advances. This animation gives us a more intuitive sense of how motion picture film captures time. One frame, one exposure, one moment at a time. This process probably feels familiar. It's because it's rooted in the same exposure principles you've used in photography. Let's pause and recall what you already know. In a stills camera, exposure is controlled by the exposure triangle. The aperture is how wide the lens opens. The shutter speed is how long the sensor or film is exposed. And the ISO is the sensitivity of the medium. These three work together to balance light, motion blur, and image noise. You've used these in your own work, adjusting f-stops for depth of field, slowing shutter speed for light trails, or boosting ISO in low light. But in cinema, things shift a little bit. Some things do stay the same, particularly the aperture that controls how much light enters the lens, and the ISO, or more precisely, film stock sensitivity, which still determines how responsive the medium is to light. But when we shift from capturing a single image to capturing motion over time, the mechanics change. A still camera's shutter opens and closes once per shot. But in cinema, we're exposing many frames to capture motion. That kind of speed demands a different design. So instead of shutter speed, we use shutter angle, a way of controlling exposure time for multiple images. And because we're locked to a frame rate, the number of frames we capture per second naturally dictates how long each frame can be exposed. So what affects exposure in a cine camera? Aperture, film sensitivity, shutter angle, and frame rate. These elements work in sync, exposing one frame at a time. How does this happen? And what does the shutter angle refer to? Let's return to this view. Let's go to the film gate side, where the film magazine attaches to the camera's body. Earlier, we represented the film gate as a red square when it's closed, blocking light from entering. What controls this opening and closing is a rotary disc shutter located on the opposite side of the gate inside the camera. Here, it is this red half circle, the part that blocks light when the gate is closed. Now we shift perspective from the film gate side to the lens mount side of the camera. This is where light enters, where the lens focuses the image, and where the rotary shutter disc lives. The red disc you saw previously is the shutter that blocks light from reaching the film gate. Here we see the actual shutter disc, aligned with the gate and claw, regulating when each frame is exposed. Its true scale is larger than it first appears. And unlike the curtain-style shutter in a still camera, this disc doesn't open and close. It spins to reveal the gate only during its open arc. Back on the film gate side, let's load up a 16mm film to see how the rotating disc aligns with the gate's exposure cycle. When the shutter arc passes over the gate, the square turns yellow, light streams in, and the film is exposed. When the opaque part of the disc covers the gate, it turns red. Light is blocked, and the film advances. This synchronized choreography, claw, gate, shutter, is what allows motion picture film to capture time one frame at a time. Viewed again from the lens mount side, this is how the shutter looks when spinning. When the camera is running, it spins continuously, regulating exposure rapidly with each pass. The disc's open arc determines how long each frame is exposed. This is the heart of the exposure system in a film camera. A mechanical rhythm, a sculptor of motion blur, a regulator of cinematic time. We've just seen how the rotary shutter disc spins continuously, revealing the film gate only during its open arc. But how fast does it spin? And how long does each frame stay exposed? Well, that's determined by the camera's frame rate, the number of frames captured per second. In cinema, the standard is 24 frames per second. That means the shutter completes 24 full rotations per second, exposing one frame each time. Frame rate isn't just a technical setting, it is a rhythmic foundation. It shapes how motion feels, how blur behaves, and how time is sculpted. Higher frame rates, like 60 frames per second or 120 frames per second, captures more slices of time, resulting in sharper motion and less blur. but they also shorten the exposure time per frame, which affects how much light each frame receives. So frame rate directly influences exposure, motion blur, and the emotional texture of the image. We've seen how a camera captures motion by exposing one frame at a time. But how does a sequence of still images become fluid movement? That is thanks to persistence of vision, a phenomenon where the human eye retains an image for a fraction of a second after it disappears. When frames are projected rapidly, typically 24 frames per second, the gaps between them blur together, and our brain perceives continuous motion. But this illusion only works when the recording frame rate matches the playback frame rate. If you shoot at 24 frames per second and play back at 24 frames per second, motion looks natural. If you shoot at a higher frame rate, say 60 frames per second, but play it back at 24 or 30 frames per second, what do you think happens? The motion slows down. Each moment is stretched and the illusion shifts. That means the illusion of motion depends on how frames are timed, sequenced, and played back. A coordinated dance between camera mechanics and human perception. Now let's see what happens when the recording frame rate and the playback frame rate don't match. This sequence contains a scene shot at 60 frames per second but played back at 30 frames per second. That means we're seeing only half the frames per second, stretching time, slowing motion, and revealing details that would normally blur past. Each moment is extended. Each gesture lingers. That is how slow motion works, by capturing more slices of time than we play back, or by playing each frame longer than it was originally exposed, extending its presence on screen. Both methods stretch time. Both reveal nuance. Slow motion isn't just a visual effect. It's a temporal expansion, a way to reframe emotion, impact, and rhythm. And it all begins with how we control the camera's frame rate. Now, what happens when the illusion created by persistence of vision is broken? One common form of disruption is flicker. This is the visible pulsing or flashing caused by irregular or insufficient exposure timing. Flicker occurs when the shutter doesn't block and reveal light smoothly, or when the projection rate isn't high enough to mask the gaps between the frames. In cameras, flicker can also result from mismatched lighting frequencies, like shooting under fluorescent lights with a shutter speed that clashes with the bulb's flicker rate. Other disruptions include strobing, ghosting, and banding, each caused by different mismatches in timing, exposure, or playback. These disruptions remind us that cinema is built on rhythm, timing, and the delicate choreography of light. In still photography, we control exposure using the exposure triangle: aperture, ISO, and shutter speed. Shutter speed determines how long the sensor or film is exposed to light, measured in fractions of a second, like 1/60 or 1/500. In cinema, we replace shutter speed with shutter angle because the rotary shutter disc doesn't open and close like a curtain. It spins continuously, exposing each frame only during its open arc. The exposure time per frame is dictated by two factors: the number of full rotations per second, which matches the frame rate, for example, 24 rotations per second for 24 FPS, and the fraction of the disc that's open, the shutter angle. For example, a 180-degree shutter angle, which is the most commonly used, means half the disc is open. At 24 frames per second, that gives an exposure time of 1/48th second per frame, exactly like setting a 1/48 shutter speed in still photography. So while the mechanism differs, the principle is the same. Exposure time is equal to how long light reaches the film or sensor. In cinema, shutter angle becomes the sculptor of motion blur, rhythm, and emotional texture. Let's look at the other shutter angles. You've learned that exposure time per frame depends on the frame rate, like 25 frames per second or 25 rotations per second, and the fraction of the disc that's open, shutter angle. For a 45-degree shutter at 25 frames per second, 45 degrees is 1/8 of a full rotation, and the exposure time is 1/200th of a second. For a 270-degree shutter at 25 frames per second, 270 degrees is 3/4 of a full rotation, and the exposure time is 1/33.3 seconds. So, 270 degrees gives longer exposure, more motion blur, softer texture, while 45 degrees gives shorter exposure, crisp motion, staccato rhythm. This is why shutter angle is the cinematographer's equivalent of shutter speed, sculpting time, texture, and emotional rhythm. Let's see how shutter angle shapes emotion. In this clip from Saving Private Ryan, director Steven Spielberg and cinematographer Janusz Kaminski used a narrow shutter angle, around 45 degrees. The result? Minimal motion blur, hyper-real staccato movement, and a visual texture that feels raw, chaotic, and immediate. This isn't just a stylistic choice, it is a psychological tool. The crispness of each frame mimics the adrenaline and disorientation of combat. The shutter angle becomes part of the storytelling, sculpting how violence, urgency, and fear are felt on screen. So when we adjust shutter angle, we're not just changing exposure, we are shaping how time feels. Most DSLR and mirrorless cameras, the ones that you'll likely use, don't offer shutter angle controls. Instead, they rely on shutter speed, just like in still photography. In cine cameras, exposure is controlled by the rotary shutter angle. In DSLRs and mirrorless systems, exposure of each video frame is controlled by electronic shutter speed, the duration the sensor is exposed to light for each frame. Both systems must sync with the frame rate, the number of frames captured per second. Here's the key logic. At 24 frames per second, each frame lasts 1/24 second. At 60 frames per second, each frame lasts 1/60th of a second. That means your shutter speed must be equal to or faster than the frame duration. Otherwise, the camera can't expose each frame in time. If you try to set a slower shutter speed, like 1/15 at 30 frames per second, the camera can't expose each frame fast enough without overlap, And most DSLRs block this mechanically or digitally. In cine cameras, motion blur is shaped by the shutter angle. In DSLRs, it's still shaped by shutter speed. That's why we follow the 180-degree shutter rule in video. Shutter speed is equal to 1 over twice the frame rate or frames per second. At 24 frames per second, use 1 over 48th of a second, rounded to 1 over 50. And at 60 frames per second, use 1 over 120th of a second. This gives natural motion blur and avoids frame overlap. So in DSLR video, shutter speed becomes your primary tool for shaping motion texture, exposure balance, and emotional rhythm. You're not just adjusting numbers, you're sculpting how time feels. Let's challenge a common assumption. It's not uncommon to think that dark equals scary and bright equals safe. But exposure isn't a genre, it's a storytelling tool. In Midsommar, a psychological thriller, the horror unfolds in bright daylight. Let's watch a clip where Danny, played by Florence Pugh, takes mushrooms for the first time. Notice how the exposure, soft, natural, sunlit, contrasts with her internal unraveling. The exposure is high, the tones are soft, but the unease comes from the perceptual disruption, her hallucinations, her panic, her emotional vulnerability. This is a reminder. Exposure doesn't just reveal, it manipulates tone. Brightness can be unsettling. Horror can bloom in daylight. What matters is how we use light, how we use motion and texture to reflect what's happening inside the character. Now let's flip the expectation. In the Banshees of Inisherin, we enter a world of muted tones and bleak landscapes. But the story is actually a dark comedy. It's absurd, ironic, and emotionally layered. Let's watch a clip from the confession scene, where the priest confronts Colm about his despair. Pay attention to the low exposure, the overcast palette, and how it contrasts with the emotional tension. The exposure is low, the tones are muted, but the emotional stakes are actually high. It's layered with irony, grief, and stubbornness. This shows us that exposure is a tool, not a genre. Comedy can live in shadows. Horror can bloom in daylight. So what matters is how we use motion, texture, and tone together, and how we shape each frame to reflect the story that we want to tell. Everything we've explored, the frame rate, shutter angle, shutter speed, exposure, they're not just technical. They're emotional architecture. These tools shape how motion feels, how rhythm breathes, and how tone resonates. Whether you're working with a DSLR or a cinema camera, your choices sculpt the viewer's experience of time. So don't just capture motion, author it. Don't just expose the image, design the emotion. You now hold the tools, so use them with purpose.